this is my second year with Set Lab, and I was super happy to be back. And so my original Set Lab question started with this common childhood refrain: "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I'm sure everyone in the room online here was asked at some point or another by someone, some well-meaning adult who cared about you very much, and intended for you to grow up to be something for the length of your professional life. Doctor, lawyer, fireman, Spider-Man, the options were limitless. But what most people weren't considering is who, whoops, who you wanted to be when you were going to grow up. And that was far more important. And that we never could have anticipated the changes in the skills, mindsets, and competencies that would be expected of our generation. Gen X, my generation, the best generation, of course, but also our millennials, centennials, Gen Zers, and the kids I'm convinced are going to be called the quarantines. So they say that what you value is what you measure. And at the end of our measurement of students in our school communities, the student report or report card is that end result. And so the question that I kept asking myself is, what is a student report for? Who is a student report for? What is school for and why? It led me down this terribly meta path of what is the meaning of life, that these days in COVID, I'm burning my last brain cells and can't really think about all that much. But my research and classroom community work for the past 2 years with Set Lab has focused specifically on who students are becoming rather than what they intend to be. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Michele. I'm currently the project-based learning specialist and middle school director at a Montessori school in Jersey City. We built our middle school from the ground up over the past 4 years. And so I, along with a few amazing co-teachers, designed the curriculum for our program. It's fully interdisciplinary and project-based. The little guy there is my son, who is part of our program and who just graduated the 8th grade. And so this is actually who he is today at 14 and a half years old. I just like to think that my husband and I look really great in that photo. And so I put up, one that's a few years older. So serving the student, not the system. My Set Lab goal was to reinvent the student report. It was my belief that by bringing together student, family, and educator perspectives, we could help students gain the most cohesive and multidimensional understanding of themselves, academically, socially, emotionally, and cognitively. So last year, I created an agile and dynamic framework, a jigsaw puzzle, so to speak, that included one-on-one advisory meetings, conferences with parents and students and our teaching teams, written narratives, portfolios and galleries of work. And honestly, from low touch to high touch, small bits of time to massive amounts of time, it was a motley mix of Google Forms, spreadsheets, handwritten Post-it notes, and meetings with my families and their students. And at that time, I only had 10 students participating last year in my pilot. And even then, I was totally drowning in data. As the two speakers, Jenny and Sora, talked about before, so much of this is qualitative and it's beautiful and messy, but documenting that in a meaningful way and then tracking growth over time with students was a really, really tricky part. But alas, I created this beautiful but not entirely functional and idealistic prototype of what a student report could be. This student report was an interactive web-based prototype, and it included information from the students themselves, things like, what was my biggest highlight this semester? What did I accomplish? What are 2 or 3 big challenges I'm having? And what do I hope to do next semester? It also had reflective narratives written by the students themselves, pieces written by the families about, their life with students at home, their perspective of what their kids were like and what they were doing, and then narratives from the teachers as well. And it seemed that as we brought all those perspectives together, it really, really helped students be more objective about themselves and also just follow along that path of self-reflection and self-assessment. It also outlined core competencies such as adaptability and collaboration, and character strengths of things like humor or humility. So they say if you reach for the moon and miss, you still land upon the stars, right? So let's just say that my current student reports do not look like this yet. That being said, in just a single school year between my first year with SetLab and this year, we implemented student, family, and educator reflections 3 times a year. We're doing weekly data gathering from students on everything from their mood on a given day to finding and identifying flow, what type of engagement they are experiencing in different classes, and providing peer reviews and reflections to help students along the way. So Sadie, for instance, here, if she identified that she wanted adaptability to be, what her area of growth was for the semester, everybody knew that. All her friends knew that. So when she was working in collaborative groups and we do peer feedback, her friends could specifically speak to her and either affirm where she was, doing really well in that area, or provide some constructive feedback on how she might, improve her work in that area. So luckily, Irvi let me stick around and keep going here. And I had set out with a few particular goals this year. My first goal was to increase the sample size of my families and get my entire middle school on board. And get them on board with those student, family, and educator reflections 3 times a year and the weekly data gathering. And that for this year meant 19 families. My second goal was to take my prototype web-based report that triangulated student, family, and educator perspectives and employ some really great back-end tech to do the heavy lifting between the data gathering and then the output of the report so that I was not slaving over those spreadsheets. And finally, I really wanted to create a framework that I could have other educators kind of test drive and tinker with, because I was aware that, a lot of what I was creating worked for my students and my community. But my end goal with this project was to create something that was agile and dynamic, that it was like, here's all the pieces of this puzzle. How do you make it work or refine it or revise it for your particular community of students? So you might ask, in the strangest school year ever, where time seems to be the ultimate construct, what actually happened? And what did my year really look like? Well, the good news is that I got a ton of feedback from my students and their families. Um, Families shared with me that, especially at the middle school level, even though we have digital galleries, even though we're using Instagram, they want to see more work from middle school students, because, those adolescents aren't bounding home with their favorite project in hand and can't wait to show mom when they get home. So families wanted to see more work. So I'm figuring that out. My students got pretty lazy about their reflections and they told me why. It's because the reflections were consistent throughout the year. And so they knew what questions I was going to be asking them, and they knew the way I was going to be asking them. So like they'd have these really beautiful narratives at the beginning of the year, and then it just got like shorter and shorter, or they wouldn't answer them at all, which forced me to revise and reiterate. I found that a lot of my parents were the same. So there was definitely a need to revise those reflections, even as the course of the year or different seasons, different projects went along. Some families continue to be really concerned about where this information lives, who has access to it, how private it is, and kind of start to freak out about what high schools are going to think if they happen to see this stuff. If my student is saying that they have these challenges, or they failed at making this certain project they were trying to do, or that they know they really struggle with being curious or adaptive, that's going to be like a negative mark on who they are as they move out of middle school into high school. And I still encountered some what I call yes but families, families who intuitively feel like yes, holistic assessment and looking at the whole child, and learning through failure and learning by doing. And yet, well, what about the grade, or what about the number, what about the letter? And again, working with middle schoolers, you run into that tricky space of where they're going next onto high school, and those perceptions of families that, especially in a Montessori environment, that we're in this safe space, but they're going to go into the real world soon. I keep trying to convince them that this is the real world, and I hope that the high school real world can look like this too. But my students did also come to the table with amazing ideas. And one of them that stands out, besides small group advisory, the fact that they love having time together in small groups to talk about these things. The one thing that came out of it that was completely student designed were character dexes. So if anybody's a gamer or familiar with video games, it's kind of like a trading card for a video game character. And so the kids, when they started doing the reflections and coming up with what their strengths were, what their challenges were, their core competencies, they decided they were going to make these trading cards with their picture, and it could be a drawing, an illustration, and then laying out all this information and like what their singular goal was for the semester. And then they would put them up all over the classroom. And so again, when it came to peer feedback, and even just that self-awareness, there were those visual reminders all around the classroom of the work that they were doing. But I did not build any back end for my data. I am still comparing spreadsheets by hand and reading long form narratives and furiously hoarding Post-it notes and voice memos on my phone. And though I started a lot of interesting conversations with a lot of interested educators, I didn't exactly yet get the opportunity to kind of hand over what I'm doing and say to any other teacher, like, hey, test drive this in your classroom with your kids and let me know how it goes. So the truth is, I did almost none of the things I set out to accomplish this year with my Set Lab research. And yet, I really feel that I did so much more. I feel that I listened first and planned later. I followed my students, my families, and my co-teachers. I revised and edited my documentation and my approach, and I added so many elements while I cut so many others. I responded to the needs of students and families and did a better job of recognizing and responding to my own biases. In the wake of COVID, quarantine, and the persistence of economic inequality, I learned that my work is really relevant and useful. And while I still have to get that back end integrated and implement more AI functions and all of that, the heart of the matter is that I responded to my students and families' needs. I learned that by working with students and families consistently and persistently, that we built trust and vulnerability and self-awareness. And I learned that the work we had already done last year in reflecting and advising and discussing totally primed us for the challenging path presented during this unique and unusual time. My community had a head start. We were more open, we were more connected, receptive, and aware. My kids used agency and spoke up. They told me when things weren't working. They asked more questions than they sought answers for. And they really settled into this space of being comfortable to say, I just don't know, or I feel really unsure. I'm a total process over product kind of person. And the journey of this work has been far more rewarding to myself, my families, and my co-teachers and my students than the destination. I will certainly continue to evolve my prototype, making it smarter and better looking, and I can improve the organization of the often beautiful and messy data. But the reward is serving my students and engaging them with their whole selves, helping them become who they want to be, has been a really, really incredible journey. So my call to action is that you can start anywhere you like, and I'm happy to help you. It could be one little Google form that could get you on your way, or one advisory meeting, or one character dex. You can really start anywhere in this process and really begin to do that work with your students, and even, I think, almost more importantly, making that connection with families. So if you want to learn more about me or my Set Lab work, I was way better at documenting last year than I was this year. So you can check out my Medium posts from my first Set Lab. I also have a ton more work to do to organize all of the interviews that I conducted with people and notes and blog posts that I wrote. It is on my bucket list. And so I'm just hoping that Irvi lets me hang around for as long as it takes. So thank you very much. And it was a really great experience to be with Set Lab again this year. Thank you.